until I got back and had the film developed that my camera had malfunctioned, and I think we got about 3 photographs from that trip. If I'd have been really smart, back then I would have taken a couple of classes, but and so it's almost the same image. And he could have been pink in the image that I shot on the right, but in Lightroom or Photoshop, you can change the color a bit, you can improve the color. And the image on the right is much more representative of what David actually looks like. And more interesting. As Linda said, my wife gave me a drawing class, and I said, well, I can't draw. And she said, but it'll help you to see better. All artists need to be able to see better. And so I signed up for this. She signed me up for this beginner's class. And about the 3rd week, our assignment was to draw our hand. And I was so excited because my hand looked like a hand. It probably didn't look like my hand, but I had a hand on the page that looked like a hand. I brought it home, and my wife hung it on the refrigerator. I took the beginner's class a 2nd time. And then we decided to sign up together for a life drawing class. And by this time, my wife, over the years that we lived in Europe, she wasn't allowed to work, and she developed an interest in watercolor, and she'd become a fairly accomplished watercolor artist. And so we took this class together, and one of the first things that the teacher said was, if you can learn to draw the human body, you can learn to draw anything. And she says, but what you have to do is you can't think, okay, I'm drawing a hand, I'm drawing an arm, I'm drawing a leg. She says you have to be looking for shapes and contours and shading, light and dark patterns. And that's what you're drawing. You're not drawing a stick figure, or you're not drawing a head. You're drawing light and dark patterns. And the same thing applies in photography. And that kind of clicked in my mind at the time that that is probably what I should be doing when I'm composing an image and when I'm looking at things that are possible subjects of photography. In late 2004, we moved back to Dallas when I retired, and I signed up for a photo workshop with a guy named Roger Moore. Roger was an retired investment banker whose mother was an artist, and he was actually very artistic. And when he retired, he became a photographer. He's very successful. And so I took a couple of workshops with him, one down at Southside on Lamar in downtown, just outside of downtown Dallas, and one at the Dallas Farmers Market, back when it was truly the kind of farmers market that we all probably grew up with. And one of the first things he said in the first workshop was, a good photograph is made between here and here. And it doesn't make any difference if you have a point and shoot or a very fancy expensive camera, the quality of your photograph is going to come from here. And I think he's right. We went on a workshop with him to Big Bend a couple years later. And in fact, we liked it so much we went twice on a photography mission, both times. A couple of years later, I think it was in 2008, we went on a African safari, photo safari with Roger. And I think that workshop, which was 10 days of fairly intense photography and early mornings, late evenings, I think at that point, photography began to click in my mind. And I began to, I think at that point, really improve. A professional photographer will tell you one of the first things you have to think about when you're making an image is, what kind of a background do I want? Because you don't want a background that's going to detract from this little guy's face, for example, or that's going to draw your eye away from the focal point of your image. So you have to think about it. Do I want it blurred? Do I want a soft background? Do I actually want some things in the background to be sharp? And often you don't have much time. We were sitting in our tented camp in the Serengeti, and all of a sudden this little guy showed up on a branch right next to the little balcony that we were on, and I didn't have a lot of time to think about what I wanted, but I knew I wanted his face, and I knew I didn't want much in the background. This photograph was my attempt to copy somebody on that same trip who had taken this stunning image in the Serengeti just before sunset of the wildebeest and these golden fields, and it was spectacular. And so the next day I was determined I was going to get an image similar to hers, and it is similar, still not as good as hers was, but I went out and had seen something I liked and went out and tried to replicate it. One of Roger's other pointers to us was to pay attention to the negative space in your image, and the spaces in the corners and on the sides that surround what is the focal point of your photograph. And it's important in close-ups, it's important in flower portraits or human portraits, just about anything. As in this one, the space around the top where you see the lotus leaf that's curving, well, those little spaces at the top don't detract, but they kind of bring your eye to that point. And so there's negative space here. Backlighting in floral photography makes for spectacular photos. And in this case, it's all green. It doesn't have to be spectacularly colored and with a variety of colors. It can be just sort of a monochromatic image. One of the tips that I give to people, or that I tell people that I learned and still struggle with, is you have to be really careful with whites and reds. Whites can kind of be washed out, and reds can just sort of blow up in your image. So if looking at this photograph, if I was going to use it for something other than a little presentation, I'd probably go back and work on the whites a little bit to try and put a little more definition in the leaves or in the petals of those daisies. And but I do like this image, and one of the other concepts here is that your subject doesn't have to be, and shouldn't probably be most of the time, in the center of the frame. I like the dark pinks that sort of offset those white leaves, and you don't really need, or those white petals, and you don't really need to see the rest of the daisy to appreciate that, yeah, this is a beautiful daisy. Back in about 2010, I signed up for a photo workshop at the Dallas Arboretum with a guy named Alan Rocock. Alan had been a photographer and a garden editor, a garden photography editor for the New York Times and Southern Living magazine. And after he retired, he began teaching people like me how to become a better photographer. So I signed up for a workshop of his at the Arboretum. And one of the first lessons that he taught us was to ask yourself the question, what's the purpose of this image? And so in his workshops, we would go out and shoot during the day, and then the next day we'd have an hour or so where we would submit a few photos, everybody would submit a few photos to him, and he would critique them. And very often he would look at the person whose photo was and say, okay, what's the purpose of this photograph? Most professional photographers will tell you that you should try to capture in your camera the image that you want. Well, I'm not a professional, and I don't trust myself to always do that, so when I'm shooting, I very often leave a little bit of room at the edges and at the top and at the bottom of my photograph, just in case what I'm seeing in my camera isn't exactly what I want. So in terms of Alan's, what's the purpose of this photograph? The image on the left is the one you saw in the previous slide. Obviously, it's a lotus blossom with a dragonfly. But the purpose of the photograph is really that dragonfly. And so, I cropped in some more to make the image on the right. And in this case, it's the one I prefer of the two. In this photograph, the photo on the left, that's as close as I could get with the lens that I had. And so I knew that if I was going to make it into anything, I'd have to do a little bit of editing. And so I did. And I got rid of that hot spot, that white spot up above in the upper left of the image on the left. And I just zoomed in again on that dragonfly. One other bit of advice, if you're going to be trying to do garden photography, you really need to have a tripod. The wind is going to blow flowers and cause them to move, and at least if you're on a tripod, your camera is going to be steady and you're not going to be moving too. Another one of what is the purpose of this photograph, we used to live on in the Swiss Avenue Historic District. And this was in our garden on Swiss Avenue. We always had monarchs come through during the migration. And again, the image on the right is really, what is the purpose of this photograph? Well, the purpose is the monarch. You clearly don't need to have an entire blossom in your image in order to tell your story or tell the story of that flower. And this iris was also in our garden on Swiss Avenue. And you know, sometimes it's even better when the part of the blossom that's really interesting fills a page. I posted this image years ago on Facebook, and my former administrative assistant, who in her retirement took up watercolor, sent me an email, and she says, okay, I'm going to copy that image and I'm going to make watercolor note cards out of it. Do I have your permission? And of course I said yes. Again, you just don't really need any more in that image. You don't need to see really all the edges of this particular plant. In this case, I took 2 or 3 shots, and I often do, at slightly different ranges, just because I'm not exactly sure what it's going to look like when it shows up on my screen in a much bigger space than what you see on your camera. Look for details in photography. The passion flower, you know, as a big blossom, I don't think the passion flower makes for a particularly gorgeous photo, but when you zoom in on the details, that tells the viewer everything they really need to know about that flower. This is another one that was from our garden on Swiss Avenue. So as you're getting into floral photography, you know, your own garden is one of the best workspaces you can have, because it's close to home. You can run out for 10 minutes if you see something, and you don't have to pack up all your equipment and lug it somewhere. Sometimes simple is just the best choice. Again, this image of the flower, you see all you really need to see. Another way of filling the frame, this one with all the various layers, you know, I wanted them to be fairly well in focus until you get pretty far into it, but it almost gives you a sense of motion. Just the way that these leaves, these petals are all curved and going into each other. As a full confession, in this particular case, this was in a greenhouse in Keukenhof Gardens in Holland, so there was no wind to make this thing more difficult to photograph it, and it was in a building that had beautifully soft light because it was a greenhouse. One of Alan's other lessons to us was, just because something is beautiful to the eye doesn't mean it's going to make a beautiful image. And clearly that's true. This was on a wildflower workshop down near Brenham with Alan Rocock, and it was early morning, just before and after sunrise. It was kind of foggy, and when you came to this field, it was stunning. And so, of course, I was taking a picture, but you know, looking at the photograph, oh yeah, it's a beautiful field of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, but I think it kind of says you should have been there. So about 10 or 15 minutes later, in the same field, from a different view, the mist started to lift, and so it created that nice V that draws you into the image. There's a photographer from our group that's up there that gives you, on the left side, that gives you a real feel for how big this field of bluebonnets and paintbrush is. And as your eye is drawn there, then you also get, and it's better in on a print or on your computer screen, the sky is actually quite pink as the sun is rising. So I think this tells more of a story than the previous image did. And this one I actually did print, and because it's all soft, no sharp edges, no real sharp lines in it, I printed it on canvas, which gives it sort of a painterly feel. I don't know if you've been to Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens in Washington, D.C., but in June and July, it's a place to view lotus blossoms. And when you walk in, this is what you see. And you walk in, it just takes your breath away. And but as we were walking in, this was another Alan Rocock workshop, he said, this place will be a challenge for you, because you're going to be so blown away by the beauty of all of these lotus blossoms that you're going to have to work really hard to create beautiful photographs. And here's the perfect example. This is what you see when you walk in, and in your mind, it's just gorgeous, but it doesn't make for a very good photograph. This is a little better, in my opinion. You get a little closer into the blossoms, and you still see that there are thousands of them. It's still not an image that I would print and hang on my wall, but if I was doing a book of photographs from Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, I might include one like this, a photograph like this in there to give you a sense of what it is you're seeing. Once I got over this sense of wow, I concluded that my best photography in this workshop was going to be to find beautiful lotus blossoms and take photographs that give the viewer a real feel for what is a lotus blossom all about. And they are stunning, and they're stunning when they're in full bloom. They're stunning as they're dying. They're stunning when they're just buds. This is another example of, I think, less would be more. This was at the Dallas Arboretum during Artscape. For about 5 or 6 years, I chaired the Artscape committee, and so on the weekend of Artscape at the Arboretum, I was there at sunrise with the artists as they were hauling their stuff in. And one year, it snowed. And it was beautiful, cold, wet, and beautiful. But when you look at this photograph, that doesn't tell you much, I don't think, about the snow and the tulips. But here's a photograph that tells you all you need to know. It snowed on the tulips. And in this case, you're seeing snow crystals, you're seeing water droplets, and you're still seeing the tulips, and you know there are a lot, that it's in a big bed of tulips because you see them in the background. One kind of fun thing, my friend and mentor, Alan Rocock, recently died. He was well into his 80s, but a couple of years ago, the US Postal Service commissioned him to take photographs of some of the iconic gardens in the US. And on the left, they made a series of postage stamps called America's Gardens. And about a year and a half ago, they asked him to do a series of flowers. And they issued that, I think that series 6 or 8 months ago. And so it's kind of fun to have stamps like this if you're actually using real mail, sending notes and cards to friends that actually have a beautiful image on the outside. Alan Rocock was a garden photographer for a newspaper and a magazine. So he had this philosophy that when you're photographing, you should be trying to tell a story. You should give people a sense of place when you're at a place that you think is stunningly spectacular. And then you should do a little vignette that gives them a little gets in a little bit closer, but still has a sense of space to it. And then finally, you should do something that's a close-up that tells them this is what the detail is in this place. So I went on a private workshop with him to Bosque del Apache, a wildlife refuge in Socorro, New Mexico, and to White Sands National Monument. And so this is my sense of place photo from Bosque del Apache. The Canadian snow geese and the sandhill cranes migrate to this area in the winter, and they winter there. And so this, in the morning and the afternoon, from wherever they are, they all take off and go someplace else. And this is what you see what you get when you have thousands of Canadian snow geese taking off at the same time. This was my attempt at a vignette, which still tells you there's a lot of birds there, but it gives you a little more detail and a little more close-up of what they really are all about. And finally, my detail. I deliberately wanted the wings in this to be a little bit blurred so that you could feel the sense of motion, and the background is, of course, blurred. But this guy is coming in for a landing, and I think it tells you a lot about what the structure of a snow goose is and shows you how beautiful they really are. At sunset in Bosque del Apache, New Mexican sunsets, are famous, and this place doesn't disappoint. It's just stunningly beautiful just before sunset in the golden hour and in the blue hour for 20 or 30 minutes after sunset. And this was the evening resting place for sandhill cranes. And so they're coming in, not all together in this case, but they're coming in to spend the night. And this is my vignette. The first one was my sense of place. This is my vignette, which would make a really good metal print, I think. I like to print on metal if you have a lot of really strong colors, and especially like blacks, and with all these silhouettes and the reflections, the orange. I think this one would make a good metal print. In my case, once you get to this level of light, it's actually pretty dark out by then. And of course, you do need a tripod. And when I first started taking photography workshops, the instructors would tell us, if you're going to shoot at less than 1/60th of a second, you probably need a tripod. And I'm going to be 71 in a couple of weeks, and I can tell you that I can't shoot at 1/60th of a second and hold my camera steady anymore. So I really need the tripod. And here's my close-up. It doesn't show up as well here as it does on the screen, but I just had my camera on burst at this point, and when I saw these two sandhill cranes, because they were stationary, but they were moving, they were feeding, and so I probably have 8 or 10 of this, similar to this image, and I didn't really know until I was looking through my photos for the day that I had this one of one of the cranes with his head underwater getting something to eat, and the other one there, and it turned out to be my favorite, so that's why it's in this presentation. Keukenhof Gardens in Holland. I went there with Alan Rocock as well. We spent a couple of weeks in Holland during tulip time. And if you've been there, you know that there are tons of vistas in Keukenhof Gardens of tulips and daffodils, just everywhere you look. And they're amazingly similar year after year. I have photos from 25 years ago when we went to Keukenhof, when we were, at the time we were living in Paris. And I was amazed at how similar the garden beds were laid out 25 years ago and still to this day. But anyway, this is my sense of place photo. I think it gives you a good feel for the size of the gardens, that they go on kind of forever. In the next photo, you come in a little bit closer and have a little less of a vista, but you still see a nice pattern in the flowers. That winding line kind of draws your eye into the image. And then finally, my close-up. And of course, you can do tons of these in Keukenhof Gardens, and every variety of tulip that you might imagine. When we were at Keukenhof, Alan managed to get our little group in. We went in the morning with the gardeners at 5 a.m. The gates don't open till 9. And we stayed for an hour after it closed. So we had the place to ourselves early in the morning, which was wonderful for us as photographers. And it also enabled us to get images like this, where there are water droplets all over this tulip because the sprinklers have been on. But you can also create this anytime you want by just carrying a little spray bottle of water with you, and if you see an image you like, you spray it, and then you have it. This is in White Sands National Monument in New Mexico. In landscape photography, you're always looking for lines that will draw people's eyes into the photograph. And this isn't my favorite photograph from White Sands, but I love this. This is gypsum, and they have snow plows that go in and plow these roads that are all gypsum, because overnight they kind of get covered, and all the footprints in the dunes disappear overnight. Anyway, so this road going in was I thought pretty attractive. Looking at the image a long time after I'd taken it, I realized that there's all kinds of sky in that background, which it's not very pretty, and it doesn't really tell you anything. So if I were doing it again, I'd crop it out as I did here. I might even crop it a little bit more, and you still get that winding road that draws you into the image. In addition to Keukenhof Gardens, we spent about a week when we were in Holland, just driving from place to place looking for for beautiful photography. And again, here are leading lines in this picture. This was a big field, and the leading lines don't necessarily take you anywhere, but they do draw your eye up to the truck and the equipment on the left side of the image. 10 years ago, maybe even less, I probably would have I would have moved so that that truck wouldn't be in my picture, because I'm taking a picture of tulips, right? But in this case, I think it gives you, I've learned a lot since then, it gives you a sense of how big this field is, and those lines draw you up, and I think they just add a little, the equipment on the edge just adds a little bit of interest to the image. In this case, we drove up to this field that it had rows of tulips in all stages. Some had died, some were just budding out, some were in full bloom. And when we got there, there was a train going by in the distance. And so a little light bulb went off in my head and said, oh, I think that's going to be my image. And so I walked around this field for about 10 minutes looking for what I thought was the right spot, set up my camera, put it on a tripod, and I wanted to use a fairly fast shutter speed, but I wanted everything to be crisp because I was going to get this train, I'd get a train, and it would be moving fast, and I wanted it to be in focus. It took about 15 minutes before the train came, but I think the train in this picture kind of makes the image, and the lines of the tulip fields draw you right up to that left corner in the direction that the train is heading. Sometimes you just get lucky. I was out watering pots in the garden one morning, and every year we used to get a few hummingbirds in the season. And I saw a couple of hummingbirds this particular morning, so I went in and got my camera and got my tripod and set up my camera in an area where this lantana was, and just thought, well, maybe they'll come back. And they did. And you have to use a very fast shutter speed if you want to get any sense of what the wings actually look like and not just a complete blur. But the hummingbirds came back, and again with my camera on burst, I probably took about 10 or 15 images, and I'd say maybe 4 or 5 of them were actually what I thought were fairly good images of a hummingbird. Sometimes you get lucky. My wife was a volunteer at Texas Discovery Gardens, and so every year during the state fair, we would volunteer to be docents at Texas Discovery Gardens. And so one year I was on a break from my assignment, and I went into the butterfly house, and there was a little girl there with her mother, and the little girl had this piece of paper, Texas Discovery Gardens, with some descriptions of the butterflies. And with a little bit of luck, this buckeye just happened to land on her piece of paper standing right in front of me. And I've tried to sell this picture to Texas Discovery Gardens several times, and they haven't bought it, but I think they should. This was in our garden on Swiss Avenue. We had milkweed and frostweed in the back, and of course the monarchs love it. And back in the days when Mariana Green was the garden editor for the Dallas Morning News, she happened to be a neighbor of ours in the Swiss Avenue Historic District, and she called me one day and she said, I'm doing an article for the garden section, back when there was a garden section. And she says, it's on the monarch migration, and I need a good photograph of monarchs. And she says, I know that I see them in your garden all the time when I walk by. She says, do you have any photographs of them? So I sent her a couple, this one was my favorite, and she ended up using it in her article. And when she sent me a little thank you note, and she says, now, if I could just get the photographers at the Dallas Morning News to understand what a photograph of monarchs is supposed to look like. These were both in our garden on Swiss Avenue as well. You know, the little beetle I call it a beetle, I'm not a gardener, but on the blossom on the left adds a lot to that image. I think it just, the flower by itself, I think is pretty beautiful, but that little beetle just tells you a little different story. And on the right, that blue sky just sets off that butterfly in such a beautiful way. Those are a couple of pictures where when I would show them to people, I'd say, you just had to be there. It was spontaneous. Just before the pandemic, I took a trip to Easter Island. It wasn't a photography trip, but that's what it was for me. And we were there during their annual, it's called the Tapati Festival, and they're celebrating their native culture. And this is actually one of my favorite photos from the trip. I think it tells you everything you need to know about this guy. Obviously, he's an athlete. You can tell by his body. He's got the floral crown, which is a big part of their celebration, flower leis and crowns. And the Pacific Ocean blurred in the background, sort of setting him off. If I were to print this photograph, I would go back into Lightroom and I'd get rid of the crest of the wave down at the lower right. The white kind of is distracting to me. And then there's a big rock formation that is actually off to the right, and I'd cut out that rock that's sitting there too and just make it a portrait of this guy. In Iceland, this is one of the nastiest birds you've ever seen. They're Arctic terns, and they're mean. They dive bomb you. They try and get rid of you, basically. And we were on this little island, and it was full of them. They were everywhere. And you carry a stick with you and wave it around, had a little flag on the end of it, and you wave it around to keep them away. Anyway, I got to a spot where there were quite a few in the air, and so I just stopped and got my tripod out and sat there and was shooting images of them. And at the time I was really disappointed because the sky was so gray. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be beautiful if this was a blue sky? But once I got home and looked at this image, I think the blue sky probably would have detracted from this. I think the white sky still sets off these birds, and it also sets off you can't quite see it on here, but their beaks and their feet are bright red. And so in a printed image, that just pops right off the page. One of the things that Alan Rocock taught me that stuck with me for a long time is that even a dying blossom can be photogenic. Sometimes it might be more photogenic than that same flower in full bloom. So when you're out scoping out possible shots, don't ignore the blossoms that seem to be past their prime, because they can make beautiful images. The poppy, this is down near Brenham during wildflower season. And I think either one of them, it's not this flower is past its prime, but it's still beautiful. As is the lotus when you get up close and see all the detail in a lotus blossom. And even as things are fading and wilting, I think they still make for some stunning images. Lighting's everything. If you're going to get really good photographs, you have to be out early, you have to be out late, and you have to be looking for, even if you're not out early and late, you still have to be looking for where is there really good light. Can I find a backlit blossom somewhere? Because it really tends to set off the photos. This one was in Japan, a dogwood, and it was really middle of the day, so the sun was not the best, but there was just enough of the tree around it that the sun didn't just blow out the whites in the dogwood. This is a Chihuly rose, and this is kind of getting into fine detail, I suppose, but this was in our garden on Swiss Avenue as well, and it was early morning, so the light was nice. Took this photograph on the left, and I really liked it. But there's this hot spot on the left side in that green leaf. There's that white spot which kind of detracts, and so I went into Lightroom to try and fix that. And while I was in there, I thought, you really don't need quite as much space on the right side of that photograph to set off the beautiful shape of this rose. So I just cropped in a little bit more, and it doesn't take much to change, I think, the quality of an image. This is at the Arboretum. I had struggled for 3 years. I loved this Japanese lantern, and I had tried so many times to get a photograph of it, and I didn't ever like any of them. I did do a drawing of it that I kind of liked, but I never got the photograph I was looking for. And I was in a workshop, and we were there just before sunrise, and we got sent out for sunrise, and I decided to go back to this spot I think it's near the Fern Grotto in the Dallas Arboretum. And I was busy trying to find just exactly the best angle that I was going to get, and all of a sudden the misters went off. And I just said, but this was destined to be, this is my photograph of this of this lantern. So that's all what looks like fog is actually the misters that are going off to water the ferns. This one's on the side, doesn't show up as well here as it would in a print. This is on the side of a busy road in Holland, and it's just around sunrise. And we pulled off the road because we thought there might be something on the other side of the shrubbery that lined the road. And sure enough, here was this canal. And it was early morning. The colors are all very muted. It has beautiful reflections. The sky isn't spectacular, but it's nice. And you'd have no idea, if we hadn't stopped there and gotten out of our car and walked 100 yards, we'd had no idea that this scene was even anywhere close to where we were. Backlighting can be really good. In this case, you don't see the front of the daffodil, but it's a daffodil, and you see the orange. And this is very early in the morning this year at the Dallas Arboretum. During the pandemic, I spent a lot of time going through old photographs, and this one was from Holland, which was a trip several years ago. I made a book of that trip, and when I saw this photograph going through them again this past year, I thought, I wonder why I didn't put that one in my book, because I really like it. And so don't delete all your photos that you don't catch your eye immediately, because sometimes when you go back, you see something that you just missed before. This is in White Sands National Monument at the end of the day, before sunset, clearly. But the sun is low enough that it's casting these long shadows that are crisscrossing through the waves in the gypsum, and it just kind of draws your eye into the photo, I think those lines do, and then up to what is actually quite a beautiful cloudy sky. Another one from Bosque del Apache, just after sunset. And again, the colors are just incredible. And interestingly enough, I was with Alan Rocock on this trip, and once the sun set, almost everybody left. And we were there for a good 30 minutes every night after sunset. And most of the time, we were the only people there, and we couldn't figure out why nobody else was staying, because it was really the most beautiful time of the day. Same area in Bosque del Apache, but from a different perspective. This was down at Brenham at a wildflower workshop, waiting for the sun to come up. And I love silhouettes. And this sky as the sun is coming up, and you see the little, I called it an oil rig one day, and somebody told me that's not what it is, but I'm a Yankee. And to me, it's a little oil rig. But I think the silhouettes, and those are other photographers in there, but I think the silhouettes work pretty well in this picture that set off the sunrise. It took me a long time to learn that people and structures shouldn't necessarily be excluded from a photograph. And I would patiently wait for people to get out of my way, or I'd move to get a different angle so that the wheelbarrow wasn't going to be in the picture. This is in Keukenhof Gardens, and this picture wouldn't be much except for the gardener that's in there showing us what he does for a living. This is on Easter Island as well, and it's just the only reason I put it in here is, see on the right side there's a man, and these are the moai, the iconic huge statues that are 1,000 years old on Easter Island. That guy gives you a good example, a good feel for how big these things really are and how magnificent they must be when you get up close to them. This was in Ireland. We had stopped for lunch here in a little pub in a small town, and I loved this building, and I loved all the flowers. This was in August, so it was full bloom in Ireland at the time. And I did wait patiently for people to get out of my picture and for cars to get out of my picture. And I got this one. I did have to do a little bit of work to eliminate some extraneous things, but about a year after we came back, I saw this same photograph in an ad from Travel Ireland on TV. It wasn't my photograph, but it could have been. This was in the gardens at Hetlu Palace, one of the royal palaces in Holland. And they're very formal, and I wasn't really into it that day, photographing very formal structured gardens so much. And we were getting ready to leave, and I was walking down this gravel path, and this fountain was in front of me, and all of a sudden I saw this little girl coming at me. She was just running, and I thought, this could be a picture. And so I set my tripod down, and my camera was on my tripod, and I just waited for her. And she came up, and she was so mesmerized and thrilled with this fountain. And I think it just made for a photograph from a very formal garden that is kind of fun. As I said earlier, don't ignore dying vegetation. We had stopped, this is in eastern Washington state, and I went to the wheat harvest this year. And we had stopped at a grain elevator that was probably 100 years old, and so it was in all sorts of disrepair. And it did make for some interesting photographs. But as we were walking around, I saw these dandelions, that some of them were further along than this, but they were in just the right light. And I thought, you know, that might be a good picture. And interestingly enough, a friend of mine who had been there a couple of weeks earlier when she posted a couple of her pictures on Facebook, she had almost exactly the same image as I did, and it's probably from the same place. You know, there's so much beauty all around us that you just have to keep looking for it and train your eye to look for it. You can make a portrait like the one of the parrot tulip on the left. That was at the Arboretum. You do, and I still have to, pay attention to distractions. The tiger lily on the right was in our garden in the Swiss Avenue Historic District. And if I was doing it today, I'd pay much more attention. I don't like the green stem down in the lower left, and I would have probably either moved to get rid of it, or if you were really patient, you could go into Photoshop or Lightroom and get rid of it, but it would be pretty painstaking work. Another little trick I learned from Alan Rocock, sometimes when you're doing floral photography, both of these water lilies were white, and we both liked the image, but it didn't really say much to us. Well, he had spent a lot of time developing a technique where he would remove blacks from his photo, and it gives them this sort of ethereal quality that is totally different than what you actually saw when you were there, but it can set off a blossom in a totally different way than if you had it in the same full color that it was originally shot. Look for reflections, look for strong colors, look for things you can zoom in on to actually get up close and get the good photograph. Everything doesn't have to be in perfect focus. In this image, in the original of this image, that tulip in the front is in pretty good focus, but everything behind it is not. And I wouldn't want, looking at the image, I wouldn't want the things behind it, the petals behind it, to be in focus. And I even went in on the tulip in front and softened some of the lines a bit, just to give it a more ethereal kind of quality. So just like if you, as a gardener, sometimes if you want to get the best photograph, you just have to get down in the dirt. And obviously the picture on the left I didn't take. A friend of mine took it for me when we were in Holland. The photograph on the right is my wife in Iceland, the master gardener, trying to capture tiny little flowers that were down in the moss. This is my last photograph of this presentation. This was in eastern Washington state during the wheat harvest. These are wheat fields. If you haven't been there, the area is called the Palouse, and it's like nothing you've ever seen. This is at sunrise, and these fields are not flat in any way, shape, or form. They're almost like sand dunes, and you see the combines climbing up and down, harvesting, but at sunrise and at sunset, these golden wheat fields turn all kinds of colors. I didn't believe it before I got there. I had seen some pictures, and I just said, these people have totally manipulated their photograph. That's not possible, but this is what came out of my camera one morning at sunrise. And it too, just because it's sunrise and it's soft light, it has kind of a painterly effect. I actually printed it on metal, but people that see it still think it might be a painting. So, thank you very much.